Mr. Jared Yates, who is going to be presenting on the TR-3B. This is something that you've talked about in the past, but again, I asked you to present on this, and the reason was I think that this is so highly relevant, considering what like David Grush and others have been talking about. I mean, the UAP phenomena there is so much movement in that story so rapidly. I think it's good to do a refresher on the technology that may be involved with it, right? And so with the TR-3B, I think as we understand things, that may or may not be a reverse engineered version of some kind of an ET spacecraft or something along those lines. But without any further ado, Jared, let me turn this over to you. And do you have a slideshow loaded that I can use, right?
Yep.
Perfect.
There we go.
Perfect. Okay. Well, I will mute myself out. And again, thank you again, Jared. It's truly a pleasure and an honor to have you present on this.
All right, everybody. Thank you for sticking around. I'm really excited to share this updated version of my research into the flying triangles. I got a lot to cover in a short amount of time, so I'm going to talk a little fast. So warp drives in the TR-3B. I'm going to tell you what it is. I'm going to tell you who built it. And I'm going to give you my speculation based upon a lot of research as to how I think it works. So this project was bigger than the Manhattan Project. So we have a shared mental model of this thing. I got a bunch of pictures to show to start us off with. You can see in the middle there, the big U-safe top secret nuclear power thing. That's from Ed Fouche from 1997, his presentation where he kind of blew the whistle on this whole thing. All over the place. I got some other pictures here in the right-hand side. You can see a bunch of blurry photos like you see for most UFO stuff. Just a heads up, you're going to see a bunch of hyperlinks all over this. I'm going to share and upload this presentation after we're done here into the description of a lot of these videos. So if you want to go back, you can click on these pictures and you can track down where these videos that I got these pictures came from. So much good materials out there if you know where to look. So there's a lot of different potential models of this. There's not just one model. The one that Ed Fouche shared here, you can see it's got a width of about 61 meters. Turns out, word on the street is, there's about 9 different models, if not more, of this craft. I'm going to be focusing primarily on the 300-foot and the 600-foot width versions. There's fakes out there, by the way. You can see on the upper left-hand side there, you got this CGI thing that showed up a few years ago where it was sitting on a Navy carrier. That same CGI thing showed up in videos over Afghanistan, and then a video over Virginia. That top center image is the video over Virginia. There's a lot of similarities in these, which is quite interesting because it's pretty well confirmed that carrier picture was a fake. And then the picture on the far upper left from Afghanistan, that one, it looks pretty CGI as well, but it looks exactly the same. So who's coming out with all of these things? I can't tell you. The upper right picture there, that's for the TR-3A, completely different propulsion mechanism. That's just a scramjet thing they came up with around the same time as another alternative airframe, but it is not the anti-gravity model. Just for a side note, that upper right image, that picture was taken in July of 2019, just a couple miles away from me here, right next to the Air Force Base that I worked at. A bunch of pictures all over the place. I'm not by any means a photo expert, so I can't tell you what pictures are real and what aren't. I'll leave that up to other people, but I can point out things that look very suspiciously real for a bunch of added details. All right, so this thing made the headlines from November of 1989 to April, it says March, April of 1990. There was over 3,000 different reports. There was thousands and thousands of sightings all over Belgium. And it was becoming such a problem that they ended up scrambling some F-16s because they picked this thing up on radar, ground radar. They scrambled 2 F-16s to go chase this thing down. And they got it on radar on the F-16s, but the F-16s never made joy. They never saw it with their eyes. The thing shot off before they ever got close. And that kind of ended the whole Belgium Wave incident. I'm going to refer you to David Marler. This guy is the world's leading expert on flying triangles, literally wrote the book on them. He describes sightings that go back as far as the late 1800s, 1882 and 1899. These things have been around a lot longer than DARPA has been around. So for however those sightings occur, I have no explanations other than time travelers, ETs, who knows? But those aren't the things I'm talking about. I'm talking about specifically the window of time from 1980 to like the mid-90s, when there was a specific program in place by the US government to try to engineer a craft that could do what we've seen it do. Oh, and just one other aside on this. This graph here that I got, you can see the green line here is for disks, the flying saucers, the traditional ones, that peaked in the early 50s. And conversely, or inversely, the red line here is the flying triangles, and the rate of sightings for those go up as the rate of sightings for flying saucers go down. It made pop culture in the early 90s when X-Files came out with it, but you can see that we had already peaked in our sightings back in the mid-80s, way before the X-Files ever came out and put it into, you know, everybody's minds. This graph, by the way, comes from our APEC person, Don Tadaya. He's made a great interactive site with all of the new fork data combined into a single place where you can play with it. You can see locations and everything like that. Last side note I'm going to say about this is for the location where the majority of sightings occur for this, looks like it's around Lake Erie. So Northeast United States tends to see a lot more of these than the West Coast does. I have a video here. I'll try to play it. We'll see how it goes. This video, people try to say that it's a fake. This is the famous video from Paris from, I think, 2009 or 2011. This thing, you see a night vision version of the craft flying around, and then all of a sudden the center ignites with this ball of plasma, and it goes through these 3 resonance modes. Let's see if this works. I'm going to slow it down here. Oh, guess not. I'm not going to try too hard on this video, but the gist is that you see this plasma ball in the middle go through these 3 resonance modes. It's larger on the top than it is on the bottom in the second mode there. The entire size of the thing is slightly oscillating. And then we get into the 3rd resonance mode here. Just a moment. There we go. There's the 3rd resonance mode. It's far more spherical, but still not perfectly. And then the thing shoots off. I will say this, if you frame by frame that for the initial ignition of this thing, it has to try a couple of times to actually ignite. And when you frame by frame it through that, you can actually see the condensation on the top of the craft start following that ionization process. If this thing was CGI, that is an extreme level of attention to detail that I just got to give props to whoever faked it, if they faked it. I personally don't think that this video is a fake. Oops, there we go. This upper right image here is from BBC.com. They had some pictures that came out of the Belgium Wave incident. I'm going to just focus your attention on that red ring in the very center. We're going to come back to that later, but just commit that picture of that twisting red ring into your memory. So we see the shape of that light bulb was larger on bottom than it was on top. We see that the entire size of the thing goes through these different resonance modes. It gets larger and larger. It's ionizing more and more of the air around it, or it's containing this ball of plasma. Whatever it is, the size of this ball changes as it winds up. It's also quite interesting how the size of it changes from being contained from within the craft to then extending out past the craft. Last thing, I don't have the video of this one, but it's a pretty famous one from military.com in the lower right. It's 2 triangles flying in the very center. That center orb of plasma actually oscillates in 3 dimensions. It's cavitating in 3 dimensions. There's a good number of videos out there where you can observe this cavitation of the plasma ball underneath the thing, cavitating in multiple directions while it's under flight. And the rate of that cavitation tends to be about half a second to 1.5 seconds in rate. I got to give a major shout out to one of ufology's great unsung heroes, Ray Stanford. Ray Stanford has collected firsthand data on UFOs for well over half a century. Since the 50s, he's been going out there with lots of money worth of equipment for getting magnetic readings, gravitic readings off these things, all sorts of things. He's got some good polarized images of this so you can see the magnetic fields. In this particular image, you can see these balls of plasma coming off of the thing. And I've rotated them here so you can see side by side in the bottom images there. The top half of this is much smaller than the bottom half. Just a observed coincidence and similarity between that and the second resonance mode, where we see the top half being a slightly different shape, slightly smaller than the bottom half. All right, so we've gone through the what it is. Now, who did it? From 1983 to 1987, President Reagan created the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, colloquially called Star Wars program. The development of this craft started before then, but SDI put gas on the fire of developing this craft. So I'm going to focus a lot on what occurred during those few years. Before I do that, I'm just going to shove a slide right in here. So this graph is the official story for the power levels for lasers that humanity has created. You can see that we didn't get to the petawatt level, the PW. We didn't hit that until about 2000. It turns out that there was an experiment done by Ed Teller down at Los Alamos National Labs called the Dolphin experiment. In this experiment, they exploded a nuke. They funneled all that energy into a laser beam. And the energy density of that thing, it was several hundred terawatts at a 1.4 nanometer wavelength. For reference, that wavelength corresponds to about 250 or 214 petahertz, which is insanely high frequency. Also, if you follow those red lines, the horizontal line there at the top in between terawatt and petawatt, that's about the halfway mark for several hundred. And you can see that the Aviation Week in Space Technology leak about this test indicates that we were at least a decade to a decade and a half ahead of the curve. DARPA was ahead of the curve by 10 to 15 years, ahead of what has still to this day been officially disclosed. So SDI, if you boil down SDI to its most basic elements, we were in the middle of the Cold War. We wanted to make sure that we could shoot down any ICBM nukes from Russia. So Ed Teller comes along and he says, hey, if we put these exploding nukes funneled energy into laser beam, nuclear lasers, if we put these onto a satellite up in space, we can shoot down multiple ICBMs all simultaneously and create effectively a complete defensive dome around our country. This was an incredible idea that Teller did not come up with on his own. There was another scientist involved that I'm going to get to here shortly. I'm also just going to put as an aside, George Shultz, Ronald Reagan's Secretary of State. He stated at Ed Teller's memorial service in 2003 that SDI was responsible for ending the Cold War. I mean, the official story is because we just outspent them, but it's an interesting comment to make at the guy that's the godfather of the space laser idea. All right, so how does this thing work? So the space laser idea, it was called Project Excalibur. Here's how that supposedly worked. You put a nuke inside the center of that satellite. When the nuke explodes, that energy is converted into X-rays that are focused down long crystal rods like sapphire or ruby or whatever you want to do for making the coherent beam. And it's focused such that you're able to get a directional energy blast from this nuke rather than a spherical energy blast from this nuke. There were successful ground tests of this, like I said, for the Project Dolphin experiment. The vanilla OG version 1.0, it was 1,000x increase in the brightness of the nuke. So the amount of light energy that was coming out of the nuke, because we were able to funnel it into these rods and focus it, we were able to amplify it as well. So the very first one, 1000x increase off of a nuke. There was a 2.0 version, though, that you don't read about much. It's very lightly sprinkled throughout the SDI documents, but it was there. So the 2.0, the Super Excalibur version, was 1000x increase on the 1.0. They figured out something on how to get a 1,000,000x increase onto this energy coming off of these nuclear X-ray laser beams. Here is an estimate I found by somebody else online who calculated it out. At the time, there was a nuclear treaty where we weren't supposed to be doing tests for nukes larger than 150 kiloton yield. So the calculation is based off of that, although if we were putting these in space, we're already breaking those treaties. So why not go all the way and put a megaton bomb in there? I mean, who knows? But these numbers, for whoever's listening and can understand them, 10 to the 20 joules per steradian for the OG version, that's already getting insane. But then they said, let's turn that up to 11, and they went to 10 to the 26 joules. That's for the 150 kiloton. You could probably put another order of magnitude or two on that if you put up to the megaton, if not more. So here's some evidence for why we need to do this. This is a New York Times article from October of 1986. The gist is that the Soviets were working on these particle beam weapons / laser weapons over in Kazakhstan at their Sari-Shagan test range. There was evidence that they were successful. Problem was their actual output wasn't high enough to be considered a threat, but the rate of progress was. Coincidentally, Russia was begging us to stop and halt all of these broken treaty experiments into these space lasers just so that they could catch up. They were about 6 years behind us with their development. So they asked for a 10-year ban that would give them more than enough time to not only try to reverse engineer it themselves, but infiltrate and send spies over here so they can reverse engineer it even faster. The US laughed at them and said, no, we're not going to stop. We see that you're doing it. We're going to keep doing it. And so we continued. And that's what I'm going to say is what ended the Cold War, is that we beat them to the punch. All right, let's talk about the scientists involved. I got 3 names for you. The first one, probably one of the most important people of the 20th century, Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb. He worked on the Manhattan Project. He ousted Oppenheimer through a lot of drama that occurred in the 50s and took over Los Alamos National Labs. He was one of the top scientists in the country for like 50 years. He was involved in so many black projects, it's even hard to keep track of. I'm going to draw your attention here to one specific conference, the International Conference of Laser Applications. This went over a number of years, but specifically the years 1987 and 1988, there was 2 scientists. The next slide will have the other scientists, where they're talking about how these space lasers can be useful for SDI. I'm going to posit later in this talk that these space lasers were actually used for development of the TR-3B. This last part is unknown provenance and veracity. The Majestic documents, if you're not familiar with them, these things were leaked in the 90s and early 2000s. People go back and forth as to whether or not they're true. I'm going to treat this one as if it's true because it supports what I got to say. So in this document, it's a letter from Ed Teller to President Reagan in 1980. So Reagan had just taken office. In it, Teller is telling Reagan that they have a vertical takeoff and landing triangular craft that pivots on its center, that would be useful for recon. Remember, the TR is tactical reconnaissance, according to most people. But specifically, he was saying that it would be useful for protection against the ET threat. There's a whole can of worms that I'd love to get into about the ET component of this, but I'm going to leave that until maybe the end, if at all. Next scientist, we have Julian Schwinger, one of the smartest guys of the 20th century. This guy got a Nobel Prize that he shared with Richard Feynman, one of the other smartest guys of the 20th century, for his work on quantum electrodynamics. He worked with Teller on Strategic Defense Initiative, at least on the sides. He also was a keynote speaker at one of these International Conference of Laser Applications, which is how I can claim that he worked with him on SDI, because That's what these entire conferences were all about, was SDI stuff. Also, he was very well connected. He attended a month before Roswell. There was the Shelter Island Conference where these 24 super high profile scientists all gathered together to share all these ideas that are not very well disclosed as far as I know. He was spotlighted back in 47 for his quantum electrodynamics work because he figured out how to boil the vacuum, essentially. Last guy, probably one of my favorites. Dr. Friedward Winterberg is a paperclip scientist who came over in 1959. He is still alive today. He's 95 years old. He worked at the Desert Research Institute for many, many decades. It was his ideas. He's primarily involved with plasma fusion. That's what his jam has been his entire life, is plasma fusion. But he's had a lot of other interesting ideas. His ideas, though, for plasma fusion is what led to Ed Teller and the Dolphin experiment, being able to have this idea that you can explode a nuke and funnel it into a laser beam. Some of his other projects are Project Daedalus. He had the idea for Project Daedalus, which was the idea that you could have a spaceship with nukes exploding behind it, and you can ride the wave of that explosion. That one was from the 70s. He's had a lot of ideas for fusion-based propulsion, and I'm just going to make a comment here. He's got a grand unified theory that's at least worth a look at. It's at least worth giving it credit for how connected this guy has been. You should pay attention to what he says. It's about something he calls the Planck ether, which a lot of connotations there are not going to go into. His main goal in life seems to be that he wants to get inertial confinement fusion declassified because there's so much classifications around it, especially during SDI when it was strongly developed. Still not disclosed, so he hasn't been successful. But as far as I can tell, this is a good-hearted guy that just wants the world to be a better place. Unfortunately, he's really good at keeping secrets, so he's not going to spill the beans. But if anybody is listening for any of the disclosure stuff that's been going on lately, it'd be worth getting this guy in front of Congress and asking him some questions. All right, now for speculation based upon a lot of research. How does this flying triangle manage to create anti-gravity? It's a big, bold claim. I have an abstract here that is going to be very technical, and only a few people are probably going to be able to interpret what I'm saying. So let me just blast through this, and then I'll get through all the next following slides with a little easier descriptions. You have a toroidal chamber. You ionize hydrogen or some other ionizable material in that chamber to create a plasma. You seed that plasma with a small amount of beta decaying radioactive material. One majestic document I found suggested that cesium-147 would be good. I followed that up. Turns out cesium-147 has an exquisite branching decay chain with like 3 or 4 different decaying, beta decaying isotopes that come out of it, which means that you're getting electrons every time this thing decays. So you seed it with this beta decaying isotope. You then structure the plasma using its plasma frequency with RF. This is how you're going to create oscillating plasma mirrors. Those plasma mirrors are going to create parametric amplification of incident X-ray laser beams. Because these laser beams are going through the plasma that is structured, instead of dispersing, they're going to be focused, and they're going to get a twist to them, orbital angular momentum. That twist to this laser beam in the plasma is going to lead to very, very high electric and magnetic field strengths, the kind that are necessary for fusion and potentially even for metric engineering of space-time. When you exceed the Schwinger limit, you boil the space-time, you start getting electron-positron pairs, something called pair production. There's some papers out there, there's some research out there that suggests that if you oscillate these particle pairs, these matter-antimatter pairs, if you oscillate them, you can create gravity waves, you can create gravitons. That right there is the secret sauce. That's the biggest part, is if you oscillate electrons and positron pairs, you're going to be able to create anti-gravity or your own artificial gravity. All right, so to break this down, orbital angular momentum, it's a vortex. You shine a laser, it puts a twist on that laser, and because you put a twist on it, you get higher energy densities at the center. In order to create a twist on it, it has to go through some kind of medium. that's going to change the phase of the wavefront of that. So instead of having pulses, you're going to have a continuous spiraled laser beam. The momentum can be transferred back and forth between the plasma and this laser beam. Very important. So whenever you take a plasma and you move the plasma, it's a conductor, so it's going to create a current, an electric current. Well, that electric current is going to create a magnetic field, which is going to interact with the plasma. So now you have a very nonlinear, chaotic thing going on where this plasma is when this plasma is moving, it's creating fields that are causing different movement, chaotic waves inside the plasma. This has been a big problem for inertial confinement fusion for a long time. So if you put a laser through the plasma, it's probably going to want to disperse. However, you are able to prevent that and instead focus it by oscillating the plasma at its RF or at its plasma frequency using RF. This is how you're going to take the natural orbital angular momentum twisting of the laser beam, and you're going to squeeze that real tight, and you're going to be able to twist it even tighter. When you do that, eventually, what I'm getting to is I think it's possible that the Schwinger limit has been exceeded. The official story is that it's not been exceeded, even though SLAC Linear Collider managed to do it in 1995 and 1996 and create 100 particle pairs, but most folks don't seem to talk about that for some reason. Anyways, it takes some very, very, very high electric or magnetic field densities to be able to convert energy into matter, which is the boiling of space-time, the Schwinger limit. That is 1.3 exavolts, 10 to the 18 volts per meter. That is almost 4.5 gigatesla. It's such high and strong energy fields that it's really even hard to comprehend. When you do that, though, space-time starts stretching and squeezing in weird ways, such that waves that would normally propagate the same in all directions now propagate one direction differently than they propagate the other direction. So when you exceed this, you start to produce these particle-antiparticle pairs. This graph I have on the lower right, take it with a big old grain of salt. The Schwinger limit is not a hard and fast limit. It's a quantum thing going on. So you've got probabilities instead. Like once you just hit the limit, you've started producing pairs, but you're not at like 100% conversion of energy to matter. So in this graph that I got that ChatGPT, unabashedly, ChatGPT helped me with this thing. So like I said, take it with a grain of salt. But the idea is at 1.7, 10 to the 18 volts per meter, you're now at about 2/3 production of energy to matter. Once you get to 3.2 exavolts, now you're about 99% conversion of energy to matter. That's probably not an accurate statement. It's just getting the general idea that as you increase, you're going to be producing more. Since it's a very nonlinear quantum probability thing, do not rely on this graph for anything other than just a mental model. In 1997, there was a propulsion conference. Teller attended. One of the guys that presented at this conference goes by the name of Froning. In this conference, he had a presentation where he suggested that you can modify gravity if you have a very highly polarized beam of some kind. He said that if you can move electromagnetic fields through a toroid with single windings, similar to Ford's rotational field, I'll describe that a little later, that's how you're going to be able to accomplish some kind of metric engineering, some kind of EM gravity interaction. If you accelerate a plasma, a lot of cool things happen, and you can actually get superluminal plasmas. Alarm bells are going off in a lot of people's heads. Nothing is superluminal. False. Some things can be superluminal. The group velocity can be superluminal while the phase velocity is not. So I'm not going to get into it too much, but the gist is that the wavefront of a plasma, certain things can occur where the refractive index of the vacuum changes enough that the wavefront of this plasma is now actually exceeded the speed of light. Here's a paper by a guy from 1989 where this gets described a little bit better. When you ionize a gas, photoionize a gas, like with a laser. Let's say you photoionize hydrogen. The refractive index goes from the normal refractive index of the vacuum, which is 1, down to 0, which means infinite speed of light rather than the speed of light limit of c at 1. That's a big, bold claim, but that's the claim that I'm getting towards for how this craft operates. That this moving plasma mirror, this wavefront of the plasma, is able to exceed the speed of light, and as it does so, it's Doppler shifting all of the incident laser beam frequencies ahead of it, blue shifting them, and it's increasing the energy density significantly when it does that. The scooping up of these frequencies, it's called a chirp. You'll find that in a lot of other ionosphere type research and other plasma research. Chirps are very useful for tracking down this stuff. A side note here, Dr. Winterberg made a comment about Schwinger's sonoluminescence model. Sonoluminescence is like the cavitation of water bubbles, creates like a little fusion light pulse in the center of it. And the idea is that there's some 0-point energy that might be getting released from there. So Winterberg, who deals with plasmas, said that in exploding wires or plasmas, where the permittivity is less than 1, you'll end up getting these voids in between the plasmas that ends up releasing 0-point energy. 0-point energy in this case would be the conversion of virtual particles into real particles. So these plasma mirrors, once you get above the Schwinger limit, if you got a moving plasma front that's going really fast and you shoot a laser beam directly at that moving thing, it's going to reflect that laser beam, and because it's going at hyperrelativistic speeds, it's going to end up blue shifting it. You're going to get amplification and especially higher harmonic generation. That blue shifting means that you're increasing the frequency of this laser beam. So you're going from terahertz up to, say, petahertz, like we saw in the dolphin experiment. They're saying that this is one potential method for generating attosecond pulses of light, which is the kind of pulse speeds that you need if you're going to be dealing with fusion. Let's get into Sal Pais. If you're not familiar with Sal Pais, this guy came out a couple of years ago with a couple of patents. One was for what looks like the TR-3B, another one's for a fusion device, another's for room temperature superconductivity. He's got a lot of interesting ideas that, to me, sounds like he's either really deep on the inside or just really creative. I'm not really sure which of those two it is, but I'm going to give you the gist of what his idea is on how to create a craft like this. And it's similar, but not quite the same as what I'm going to be presenting. So to quote him from one of his recent interviews, he says that the Pais effect works like this. Controlled motion of electrically charged matter, plasma, from solid to plasma states, subjected to accelerated vibration and or accelerated spin via rapid acceleration transients. To put that into a little simpler to understand language, if you look at that picture in the lower right, you see all that shadowed edge around the triangle. That's an RF cavity where he is ionizing plasma using RF. This resonant plasma cavity is supposed to be able to eventually exceed the Schwinger limit. There's some other stuff going on there. He refuses to reveal some of the secret sauce about this stuff. My personal suspicion as to why he's doing that is because there is a Department of Energy component to this that requires secrecy, namely the radioactive stuff that we're dealing with. Department of Energy, the people who own all the nuclear stuff, they really don't like it when people play with radioactive things for good reason. Ed Fouche. So Ed Fouche is the whistleblower that I spoke about from 1997. He gave a bunch of talks on his experiences with interacting with the flying triangle down at Area 51. After he had talked to a bunch of his coworkers down there, he eventually was able to glean the following information about how this thing worked. He said that it was a plasma that was mercury-based, that was pressurized extraordinarily high at 250,000 atmospheres, 25 gigapascals. He said that it was operating at cryogenic temperatures of 150 Kelvin, that's negative 190 degrees Fahrenheit, negative 123 degrees Celsius. and said that it was accelerated to very high speeds, 50,000 to 60,000 RPMs, which for a 600-foot model, that would equate to about 575 kilometers per second, or equivalently, if this was a toroid donut around the edge of that craft, that'd be about 1 kilohertz frequency. A side note that I must say, many of the people who have witnessed this craft describe a audible low frequency emanating from it, somewhere in the range of 400 hertz to 700 hertz. So the fact that Ed Fouche's numbers here come out to about 1 kilohertz, quite coincidental. So if it's supercooled plasma that's mercury based, that means we're dealing with a superconducting mercury plasma. I did my homework. I found a paper out there from mid-2010s, I think, where they were experimenting with different mercury-based cuprates, superconductors. And it turns out, here's something really cool that I go back and reference constantly. If you look at these red lines in the upper right graph there, these red lines are Ed Fouche's numbers. If you notice, Hg, mercury, 1212, that particular test at the pressures and temperatures that Ed Fouche describes is right at the edge of the phase transition of the critical temperature, right on the edge. It's very important here, and here's why. Ed Teller released a paper in 1976 called Electromagnetism and Gravitation. I cannot recommend this paper highly enough. It's only like 2 or 3 pages, definitely worth a read. There's a lot of unspoken nuances within. One of the things he describes in there, though, I'm going to quote it directly. If the crystal has no ordered permanent dipole moment, but we're near the phase transition where such a dipole is established, the rotation will produce big effects which go off to infinity as the transition temperature is approached. In this paper, he was talking about electrets, which are electrically polarized materials. There are certain nuances to that. You can treat a plasma under certain conditions as if it's an electret. So at the beginning of this talk, I said that you needed to pay attention to that red ring that was on the underside of the flying triangle for the BBC picture. If you look closely at that, you can see these curved filaments coming off of it that strongly resemble that tokamak winding right next to it, which is the same geometry that Robert Ford from Hughes Research talks about with his idea back in the 60s or 70s about Ford's rotational field. He suggested that if you pumped a superconductive liquid mercury through those pipes at the same time that you rotate the entire apparatus, you should be able to generate extreme electromagnetic forces that reduce the mass and eventually are able to create their own artificial gravitic field. Very interesting overlap between the BBC image and Ford's idea. So we keep talking about superconductors. What's the deal with all these superconductors? Why has it got to be superconducting? Turns out, there's more papers out there. When you use a superconductor, you are able to lower that 10 to the 18th volts, that exavolts requirement, down to the 100 megavolts requirement. I'm going to go into reasons on how that happens. We got 3 people here. We got Ed Fouche at the top, we've got Sal Pais in the middle, and we got Eugene Podkletnov at the bottom. If you're not familiar with Podkletnov, he had a rotating superconducting disk that he slapped with some megavolt, 2 to 5 megavolt charges, and he described 2% weight loss. So we got all these guys talking about superconductors. Well, Pais is talking about fusion and Schwinger limits. The idea is that when you have a superconductor, you have these things called Cooper pairs. The electrons pair up. Well, when the electrons pair up, that means that now as they're super highly energized in the superconducting plasma, you're starting to boil space-time. You're converting those virtual particles into actual electron-positron particles. It doubles the number of those because you've got Cooper pair doubles to begin with. Also, superconductors have a much reduced band gap, that tunneling gap required to cross energy levels. So there's a band gap between the virtual particle scene and the real physical world. That band gap is normally 10 to the 18 volts. Superconductors have a much reduced band gap. They are reducing that overall tunneling requirement from 10 to the 18 down to 10 to the 8th. Well, if they reduce it down to 10 to the 8th, and Eugene Podkletnov reduced it, or Eugene Podkletnov was dealing at about 2% of 10 to the 8th at 2 to the 5 megavolts, and it just so happens he described 2% weight loss, coincidences arise. There's a couple different ways that you can try to achieve this boiling of the space-time vacuum. I've just described how you can do it with superconductors. Here's what happens when you include lasers into the mix. Normally, if you just shine two oncoming laser beams at each other of very high energy, the photons from those two will collide, and in that moment of collision, the energy will exceed the Schwinger limit, and you'll get particle pair production. However, there's something called the nonlinear Bright-Wheeler process, where instead of slamming them into each other, you just have an extremely highly strong energy density field, like the plasma field. Instead of that lower picture there says laser field, replace that with plasma field. Now you shine a photon through from a laser, and you've already now reduced the amount of added energy that photon needs to have to be able to exceed the Schwinger limit. Side note, last year there was a team with Dr. Knuth. They went down, they were called UAPX. They went down to Santa Catalina Island down in California. They spent a week down there with a bunch of different measuring equipment. And while they were down there, they observed a few different UFOs. They measured a few different UFOs. One of the best measurements, they saw one off the coast. It was a couple kilometers away, and they got triple repeating gamma ray bursts. These are gamma ray photons, by the way. Triple repeating gamma ray bursts, and the highest energy from one of these bursts was about 43 MeV, which is a lot. If you wanted to create that with an electron gun, it would need to be 10 meters long, and it would need to have a 4.3 megavolt per meter electric field, which is a lot. You're only going to get that with plasmas. So we've talked about these electric requirements. What about the magnetic requirements? Well, we come to Dr. Winterberg and another one of his papers. This one was, I can't remember when this one was from. I think early 80s or early 90s. Anyways, this one, the idea is that you ignite the plasma. The plasma extends both directions down this donut. And as it's going down there, those arrows that are tangential to the tube, they are magnets that are squeezing the wavefront of this plasma. So as you squeeze that wavefront, it accelerates that wavefront up to relativistic velocities, like I've been saying. What's cool is you get a Lorentz contraction of the front of this plasma wavefront that ends up increasing by orders of magnitude the magnetic field strength of that wavefront. He says that you can get thousands of Tesla, 10 to the 3, thousands of Tesla by doing this. Remember that number, because in a couple of slides it's going to come into play. Thousands of Teslas. Here's a more one-dimensional view of that same idea. On the far left, you have a mirror. You ignite the plasma, so it bounces off the mirror and continues over to the right side of the image. As it's going through there, those little slashed dots on the bottom are little electromagnetic power supplies that are switching closed in succession so as to accelerate that wavefront. Like I said, you can get thousands, you can get orders of magnitude increase in the magnetic field as this thing reaches relativistic velocities. Going back to Ray Stanford's images. So in 1980, Ray Stanford took this picture. He actually was videotaping this with an 8mm camera that had a polarizing cube on it. So it split one half of the polarization of the light to go up to the eyepiece, and it split the other half of the light into a different polarization that went down to the tape. When he was watching this through the eyepiece, he didn't notice anything, but upon going back and watching the film, he observed these rings coming off the corners of this craft. These rings are called Faraday rings. When you have polarized light that goes through a polarized medium, you end up getting this diffraction going on. And by counting the number of rings, you can try and estimate the strength of the magnetic field. Now, because there's probably a very strong electric field in play from the ionization going on, it's really hard to estimate, especially without good color photos. It's hard to estimate the actual magnetic field strength here, but I can at least get it within the ballpark of somewhere between 50 to 5,000 Tesla based upon his distance away from this craft, the altitude that he was at when he witnessed it, and the total number of rings. Highly recommend looking into Ray Stanford's work. I cannot recommend that enough. Also, he observed this in 1980. Let's just track with the timeline here. 1980 is 3 years before SDI, and here we got a triangular craft with similar magnetic field strengths that Winterberg was describing. Oops. All right, another important paper, and this is one of the most exciting parts, I think, of this entire talk. Ed Teller, 1992. Ed Teller leaked like a sieve. He said all sorts of classified material in not so classified settings that MJ12 was very not happy with, but not a lot that they could do about it. So in 1992, Ed Teller proposes this fusion-based propulsion device for long duration space missions. I'm just going to focus your attention here to two things. First, look at the lower right image. Notice how we have these cryogenic temperatures, 4.2 Kelvin, 300 Kelvin, 900 Kelvin. We're not quite at the 150 Kelvin, but let's safely assume that he probably adjusted some numbers so that he didn't actually get ganked by MJ12. But also, in addition to that, notice those vertical bars on the lower half of the circles in that image. Those are the MHD, magnetohydrodynamic generators, which that research is all throughout SDI. They figured out how to be able to use this plasma to generate energy to be able to then cool the plasma. They cool that plasma. That's a superconducting magnet or superconducting plasma. They're in the center where a lot of the magic happens. Now for the really good part. Figure 3 from this paper on the leftmost image there, where you got the same circular image from figure 9. You can see we got this egg-shaped magnetic field going on around this device. Side by side, I got Ray Stanford's image there, where you can also see it's kind of egg-shaped. It's a little hard to see. So let me go on to this one, where I'm going to go back and forth and just overlay them. So we got the egg shape of Ray's pick. And now we got the egg shape from Ed Teller's paper. Also, note the sizes of Ed Teller's graph here, how we're talking in terms of, a couple of meters for the heights and the radiuses of these rings. I'm just going to leave it open to speculation as to how large these rings from Ray's pick are, but I bet you dollars to donuts it's the same size. Last thing from this paper. In Ray's picture there, you can see we got these clouds coming off underneath this thing. Figure 4 from Ed's paper. At the top there, we got those egg-shaped magnetic fields and how those end up ionizing stuff around them. And that ionized material then gets ejected beneath it as it's also getting neutralized in its charge. That's part of the whole neutral particle beam stuff from SDI, if you're interested in that. Anyways, you're able to use it's not even exhaust, it's just the surrounding medium. You're able to use the surrounding medium as additional vector potential, which is fascinating. I mean, talk about efficient. All right, putting it all together. I put a lot out there for y'all. Here's what it is when you put it all together. You ionize a plasma with a really strong laser. As that ionized material becomes a plasma, you start accelerating that wavefront of plasma up to relativistic or even super relativistic speeds. It then ignites some fissile material. You create some fusion. Once you have fusion, now you got enough energy that you can start really going to town. You can use these relativistic plasma mirrors with instant laser beams at approximately 400 to 1,000 hertz of instant laser beams hitting these plasma mirrors. You're going to get parametric amplification of that laser, and you're going to start creating particle pairs out of the vacuum. Then you're going to oscillate those particle pairs to create gravity waves. And just for added benefit, if you're flying around an atmosphere, you can use the ionized atmosphere around you with these magnetic fields as additional forms of thrust. This thing's been secret for a really long time, even though we got leakers coming out. There's still no official document out there that says, yes, we have this craft. And apparently, if it's been out since at least 1980, we're going on over 40 years this thing's been out, and it's still so classified they can't tell us anything about it. What's going on with that? Well, I have some speculation for you. One, nuclear fusion would completely eliminate all need for, well, not all need, but all of the petrodollar value. And as we can see from Gulf War I and Gulf War II, the military-industrial complex seems to care a great deal about the value of oil, specifically because the entire U.S. economy, and thus all of their funding, relies upon the value of oil. Additionally, this thing has capabilities that are so extreme that to even disclose these things could provide a potential benefit to adversaries. So they don't even want to let the adversarial nations know that we have this, because then they might be able to try to start doing it themselves. Additionally, and going a little more into the conspiratorial element, UFOs, UAPs, that majestic document from Ed Teller suggested that they actually needed to develop Excalibur space lasers to be able to fight not terrestrial-based threats, but extraterrestrial-based threats. And the need was to eventually put a neutral particle beam weapon onto a platform that could keep up with these incursions of extraterrestrial vehicles that are hostile to all of us. So you can try to drink the military-industrial complex Kool-Aid and say that they've actually been protecting us. The military's been protecting us for a very long time by keeping us in the dark about the fact that we could all be eliminated in the blink of an eye by an advanced civilization, and it's only through their efforts of SDI that we're even still here today. I'm a little torn on that. As a veteran, I tend to lean more towards trust in the military, even though there's plenty of stuff that suggests it shouldn't, but overall, I tend to do so. Lastly, those neutral particle beam weapons, those things have energies of damage as great, if not greater, than nuclear weapons without the fallout. That right there is like the golden sword for all of the adversarial nations. Could you imagine Kim Jong-un or some other crazy world leader with the ability to fly a craft across the planet in a couple of minutes, blow up whatever he wants with the energy, the amount of a nuke, and then fly off, and he's in and out within a couple of minutes? That's the kind of nightmare scenario that is why it necessitates secrecy. All right, wrapping it all up for you. So the TR-3B, I'm saying that it uses one, potentially both of these mechanisms. It's using hyper-accelerated, ultra-relativistic plasma mirrors with instant laser beams to create particle-antiparticle pairs, which are then oscillated to create gravity waves. That's a field-based propulsion device. You're not actually emitting anything. However, if you're in a medium such as atmosphere, then you can use that medium as a propellant with the neutralized particle beams that are coming off of the edges of this craft with its strong magnetic fields. Here, I got a bunch of links I'm going to leave up on the screen for a second for anybody who, for whatever reason, doesn't have access to this slideshow. You can just type these in, pause and type them in. On the left there, those are the slide numbers so that you can follow up and go back through. And then there at the bottom, if you need to just type it in, there's the link to this presentation at the very bottom. Also, there is an exquisite TR-3B playlist that I have for you there, also at the bottom. If you want to get in contact with me, my YouTube channel is Massive Yet Tiny Brain, Mighty Brain, and the email for that is mightybrain@yahoo.com.
Wow, Jared, I don't know what to say. That is amazing, absolutely amazing. So let me do this. I mean, first thing, I'm going to add everybody into the stream. And I think that we need to give you an enormous applause. Mr. Jared Yates. I mean, the original TR-3B presentation that you did was stunning. This is just amazing. In fact, I was taking notes. I'm going to be doing some follow-up on a bunch of these. Friedward Winterberg is definitely on towards the top of the list there. So, well, so do you guys want to do, I mean, we've only got 2 minutes left until our lab partner time, but do you want to spend maybe 10 minutes or so and do Q&A? You guys want to do some Q&A? Let's do that, because I'm sure I haven't been looking in comments here. I have lots and lots of clapping.
I see one question here that looks pretty good. What material is the plasma coming from? So we see that Ed Fouche said that it was a mercury-based. We see a Majestic document that says that you need to seed it with beta-decaying radioactive material. We saw temperatures in that Ed Teller paper towards the very end that suggests that they were actually dealing with hydrogen. I can't tell you for sure exactly which material they're using to ionize it, but what I can tell you is that if you go through the SDI MHD papers, which primarily are geared towards naval propulsion and scramjet propulsion, that in those papers, they talk about all these different materials that they were using to try to create these plasmas for magnetohydrodynamic generators. So it's in there somewhere. I just, other than speculating that it's hydrogen, I can't tell you.
You know, Jared, if I could jump in. So one of the questions that I had was, you had mentioned someone telling President Reagan that there was a triangular craft that basically described it as the TR-3B. Are there notes that people could follow up on if they wanted to research that further?
Yes. So in those links that I provided towards the end, you can see that you can see the website. You can follow that link to the website, which is majesticdocuments.com or something like that. And they've collected all of these documents together in one spot. And it's fascinating. It is a trip to read these documents. You got to take it with a grain of salt, like you should with all of these tinfoily type things. But I would really like to mention something important specifically about that document and how it ties in with other similar stories around the time. So my personal belief in the speculation as it sits today is that there has been a ET threat among us for a very long time. That was part of the reason for the creation of MJ12. It wasn't just so we could reverse engineer technology. It was because there was evidence that these aliens, when they were turning on the Russian nukes, that they were a direct threat to the existence of humanity. And that there was a small clandestine group of people that were protecting humanity, not just by keeping them in happy, blissful ignorance, but also by trying to create deterrence for these things. Just trying to blow up a nuke isn't necessarily enough to be able to defeat these craft. Additionally, if you take Ingo Swann's word for it, he's claimed that in 1976, he was recruited by some small group, I think it was MJ12, recruited by them to go do remote viewing on the dark side of the moon. And he saw large bases over there, and the military individuals that was, recruiting him for this was very concerned about this. I suspect Excalibur, as well as the TR-3B, may potentially have actually been our military response to a threat that this group couldn't even disclose existed. And I don't know to this day whether or not that threat still exists. If it still does, that would explain a lot of the, hesitance for disclosure. But the space lasers plus the space plane that can do warp speed, you don't need that for Earth. You need that to fight the aliens. That's what the Majestic documents, anyways, are suggesting.
Yeah, it's, again, absolutely amazing presentation. Jared, thank you so much. And again, I'm just putting up, lots and lots and lots of applause. I'm not seeing, well, let me see. Jake Hunter asked, so Teledyne, Ryan sold the rights to their flying triangle to Lockheed, I guess. No?
I don't necessarily know that I would ascribe to any one particular government contractor, military contractor, the ownership of this craft, at least for the years of SDI. Those contractors were used to help develop certain components of it. I believe it was Northrop Grumman helped develop the frame. Lockheed Martin helped develop some of the fusion. But most of that research occurred in national laboratories, far more than it occurred in, S4 hangars. Eventually, though, especially I suspect, we probably ended, once again, major speculation, take it with a grain of salt, but I suspect the ending of the Cold War, Reagan was all about, hey, can't we just put all our differences aside if there was like some ET threat? It could be that there was an ET threat that we did eventually defeat in some meaningful way, or at least neutralize. And then in the 90s, they were trying really hard to disclose this. Ed Teller was trying really hard to disclose this. Winterberg was trying really hard to disclose this stuff in the 90s. And they got blocked at every single step of the way, just about. So from that, this technology, eventually this group of protective individuals kind of, changes hands and ideas of what their role should be. As they did that, now it starts changing. This tech starts changing hands to the different government contracting agencies, and that's where we're at today with the disclosure-esque stuff that's going on. Is, well, which agency owns this? Does Raytheon have this stuff? Does Lockheed have this stuff? Who's got the goods in the hangar for the reverse engineered stuff? Not even speaking about the actual recovered stuff.
Yeah. Well, Jared, so I have a couple also from Paul, and Paul was asking, he actually had two questions. One of them was, what is the material forming the plasma from? He had also asked about mercury in a separate question. And from Stan Deo, I think, had talked about something similar. And in his case, mercury was the plasma material, right?
All right, so I kind of talked about this a little bit. I'll go a little more in depth. So the original flying discs, the Vimanas, the D Glock, the Nazi Bell, all of these things, they always talk about using mercury for some reason. The best evidence for use of mercury that I can find is if you use an isotope of mercury that has a beta decay, you can get increased electrons coming out. These increased electrons are increasing your overall charge density, which is going to help you slowly start to achieve this Schwinger limit, right? However, mercury is not the best one to use for this. It's got a crummy decay branching chain. You want to use something that's got a decay branching chain that is much faster and many more steps of decay, each with beta decay occurring every time, as well as eliminating alpha decay, because alpha decay will end up quenching this stuff. You don't want that. So that said, that's why they came up with the cesium idea. I'm not super sold on the cesium, but it's the best that I got to go on for now. The mercury stuff that's last year's news. You don't need mercury stuff. Don't deal with mercury. There's much better radioactive material out there that you can use. Also, final thought on it. When you accelerate this radioactive plasma really fast, you get that Lorentz contraction. That means that wavefront is experiencing time at a different rate than we are experiencing time as the observer, right? That means that it will decay at a different rate than if it was just traveling at observer speed. So if you have something that decays in 100 milliseconds normally, and you accelerate it super duper fast, it's going to decay at a slower rate relative to us until, bam, it slams into something, or it stops, or it gets hit by a laser. And then now that momentum transfer is going to change its velocity. You're going to get a way different amount of beta decay coming off of it. A spray of electrons from this beta decay is all going to happen when it decelerates super fast.
Okay, and that was cesium-148, right?
47.
147.
You only can create from nuclear explosions anyways.
Okay, well, there we go. Does anybody else have any questions? Let me see. Anybody in our audience here? Mark, Jeremy, Chris, and let me see. Michael is there. Michael is out of camera, though. He's hiding.
I have some comments, but I don't know if you guys can hear me well, because we have the machines turned on behind me.
Yeah, I can hear you.
So one thing I wanted to mention to Jared, I know you look at it sort of as an alien threat because they turned on they put the rockets in Russia to the ready mode. In America, what they did was they shut it down. So I think that has more to do with the Russian mentality versus the American mentality. They wanted to scare us both off, but to do it in Russia, what they do is they're arming the nukes like, hey guys, you're about to blow yourselves up. And in America, they're like, no, you guys are not going to be able to control this. We'll take it apart. And I've actually heard of a story, and take this with a bucket of salt too, that a gray alien materialized in one of these nuclear facilities and took apart a detonation device in front of a bunch of officials, and then like disapparated Star Trek style, as one of their, you know, screw you kind of things that they're showing us. But in Russia, with a different mentality, different culture, the way to do that was to arm them, you know, freak them out, say, hey guys, you shouldn't be playing with this.
That's really interesting. One added thing, if I might put out there. So I was using it as one particular example. I suspect that there have been many examples out there of how they presented themselves as a threat or as untrustworthy at a minimum. One other example of their untrustworthiness, supposedly, bucket of salt, there was a interaction between President Eisenhower, Ike, and some great aliens where they came up with some kind of agreement because we weren't okay with them just, you know, violating our airspace willy-nilly all they wanted and going and scaring people and maybe even revealing themselves in ways that we didn't want. So there was an agreement that was made. The story goes that supposedly they wanted to be able to understand our genetics better so that they could do all sorts of stuff to help themselves with. The agreement was that we would provide them with cadavers, dead bodies. They can do all their genetic testing on the dead bodies. They reached that agreement, and then shortly thereafter, the aliens broke that agreement and they started abducting people. If you look through all of the abductions of people, there's plenty out there that are not good abductions. I mean, the Betty and Barney Hill one is like the most famous, but there's a lot of stories out there. Final part on it, some of these actually result in human mutilation. That's the scariest side of all of this, is if you look into human mutilation from alien encounters, there's some bad stuff out there where it looks exactly the same as cattle mutilation, except done on human bodies rather than cattle.
Okay, so I think that probably concludes our presentation for today. We'll end it on the human mutilation note. So everybody, let's give Mr. Jared Yates again an enormous applause. Jared, thank you. I think people should probably stop and reflect for a moment on the amount of research that it takes to do those presentations, right? And, you know, and this would apply to everyone who is up there, because you guys all do presentations, right? And I know Jeremy has done he's done many that are the same as well. And Mark is in his lab doing research right now. But the amount of work that it takes to go through and collate and organize all that information and follow up on all of that is just tremendous. It is tremendous. And so, you know, thank you so much.